Understands. They thought you would always come back. They became distant, pulled away, went quiet, and somehow expected the same story to repeat itself. You would feel the distance, question what happened, reach out, explain yourself, try to repair the connection, and eventually find yourself standing at the same emotional door again. But then something changed. Understands. You stopped. You stopped sending the message. You stopped asking for an explanation. You stopped trying to convince someone to recognize the love you had already shown them. And that moment may have changed the entire psychological dynamic between you. Understands. Because when someone becomes accustomed to your pursuit, your absence can create a kind of uncertainty they never had to face before. The person they assumed would always be available suddenly becomes quiet. The person who always tried to repair the connection suddenly steps back. And beneath that silence, something deeper can begin to happen. Understands. The avoidant attachment pattern is often misunderstood as simple indifference or a deliberate attempt to hurt someone. Psychological research paints a more complicated picture. Understands. Avoidant attachment can involve a tendency to reduce emotional dependence, create distance during moments of vulnerability, and rely heavily on self-protection when closeness begins to feel overwhelming. Yet there is a lesser-known part of this dynamic that becomes especially important when the other person finally stops chasing. Understands. The usual emotional sequence loses its familiar ending. There is no immediate pursuit to respond to. There is no repeated reassurance waiting around the corner. There is simply a person who has stepped out of the cycle. Understands. And that can force a question to appear that was previously easy to avoid. Are they actually gone this time? In this video, we are going to uncover what can happen psychologically when the person an avoidant expected to chase them finally stops. Understands. You will learn why repeated pursuit can keep the push and pull dynamic alive. Why silence can initially create relief before deeper emotions appear. Why an avoidant can sometimes recognize the value of someone only after the usual pattern has been interrupted. And why their return, should it happen, does not automatically mean genuine emotional change. Understands. We will also explore the difference between missing someone and being ready for intimacy, between regret and responsibility, and between returning to a familiar connection and actually building a healthier one. Most importantly, this video will take the focus beyond the question of whether the avoidant will come back. Understands. Because that question can keep you emotionally trapped in the same cycle. The deeper question is what happens to you when you stop measuring your worth through another person's willingness to stay. There is a powerful psychological shift that can happen when you stop chasing someone who keeps creating distance. Understands. You begin to see the relationship from outside the emotional storm. You begin to recognize patterns instead of reacting to every withdrawal. You begin to understand that love can exist without endless pursuit, and that caring about someone does not require sacrificing your peace to keep them close. Understands. Stay with me until the end because the final part reveals the most important lesson of this entire dynamic. The moment you stop chasing is rarely about making the avoidant chase you. It is about breaking the pattern that taught you to chase in the first place. Understands. And once that pattern breaks, the entire meaning of their silence, your silence, and the relationship itself can begin to look completely different.
Welcome to Conscious Healing Hub, where we explore attachment, emotional path, psychology healing, and the hidden dynamics behind human relationships.
Understands. Subscribe to the channel and join us, because sometimes understanding the pattern is the first step toward finally becoming free from it. One of the first psychological shifts in this kind of relationship happens quietly. It develops through repetition. Nobody has to announce it. Understands. Nobody has to consciously decide that this is how that becomes familiar. The avoidant pulls away, the other person feels the distance, and then the other person reaches back toward them. A message arrives. An explanation follows. An attempt to reconnect appears. Understands. The tension eventually settles, and the relationship continues. The avoidant becomes distant, the other person becomes anxious about the distance, and the same response follows. Over time, repetition can create expectations, even when those expectations are never spoken aloud. Understands. This is where the relationship can begin developing its own emotional rhythm. The avoidant learns through experience that creating distance does not necessarily lead to losing the relationship. They can step back and still find the other person waiting. They can become quiet and eventually receive another message. Understands. They can avoid an emotional conversation and discover that the relationship remains available. This does not automatically mean the avoidant is deliberately using the other person's love. That would be too simple. Attachment patterns often operate beneath conscious awareness. Understands. A person who has learned to protect themselves through emotional distance may experience withdrawal as a familiar way of managing closeness. They may feel overwhelmed, regain a sense of control, and then return when the emotional intensity becomes easier to tolerate. Understands. When the other person repeatedly remains available throughout that process, the cycle becomes easier to repeat. At the same time, the other person learns something too. They begin to believe that closeness has to be restored through effort. When the avoidant pulls away, they reach out. When the avoidant becomes colder, they become more understanding. Understands. When communication decreases, they increase their effort. They may start choosing their words carefully, giving more reassurance, becoming more patient, or trying to prove that they are safe to love. Somewhere along the way, their mind can begin connecting effort with connection. Understands. The internal belief becomes simple. If I try harder, I can bring them back. That belief can become powerful because sometimes it appears to work. The avoidant eventually responds. The conversation resumes. Affection returns. The relationship feels alive again. That temporary reconnection can make the entire cycle stronger. Understands. This is one of the lesser-known problems with inconsistent closeness. A relationship does not have to provide consistent emotional security to become deeply compelling. In some cases, uncertainty itself can make a person more focused on the relationship. The moments of distance create tension, while the moments of reconnection bring relief. Understands. The contrast between the two can make the return feel unusually powerful. The person who has been waiting finally receives a response, and the nervous system experiences that response as a release from uncertainty. Then the relationship feels good again, at least for a while. Eventually, another withdrawal happens, and the cycle starts over. Understands. For the avoidant, the experience can look different. Their nervous system may become accustomed to the relationship surviving periods of withdrawal. They may never sit down and think, this person will chase me forever. The expectation can be much quieter than that. It can simply become part of their experience of the relationship. Understands. Distance has happened before, and the relationship survived. Silence happened before, the other person returned. Conflict happened before, and connection was restored. From their perspective, separation may begin to feel temporary rather than final. That creates an important psychological distinction. Understands. A person can become comfortable with distance because distance has never truly cost them the relationship. They may associate closeness with pressure and distance with relief, while also knowing somewhere in the background that the relationship will still be available later. This creates an unusual form of security. Understands. They may feel secure enough to withdraw because the other person has repeatedly demonstrated that they will remain emotionally present. The relationship becomes a place where they can move away without experiencing the full reality of losing access to the person. And this is where the title takes on a deeper meaning. Understands. The avoidant may have become accustomed to a version of the relationship where you always return. Your pursuit becomes part of the emotional structure. They move away, you move closer. They create silence, you break it. They create uncertainty, you provide reassurance. Understands. They step back from the relationship, and you carry the responsibility of bringing the connection back together. Eventually, the pattern can become so familiar that neither person realizes how much their behavior depends on the other person's reaction. Then something changes. You stop responding in the familiar way. Understands. The avoidant pulls away, but you do not rush forward. They become quiet, but you do not immediately fill the silence. They create distance, but you do not spend your energy trying to remove it. For the first time, their withdrawal produces a different result. The relationship does not immediately return to its old rhythm. Understands. The person who used to chase is no longer chasing. The person who used to repair the distance is no longer automatically taking responsibility for closing it. That change can create uncertainty because the old expectation has been interrupted. The avoidant may suddenly encounter a situation their previous experiences never prepared them for. Understands. Distance has always been followed by your return. This time, distance is followed by your absence. The familiar pattern has lost one of its most important parts. And when a pattern loses the response that kept it predictable, both people can begin experiencing the relationship differently. Understands. The avoidant may start noticing that your presence was never guaranteed. Your availability was a choice. Your patience was a choice. Your continued pursuit was a choice. And once you stop making that choice, the emotional meaning of their withdrawal can begin to change. Understands. Chasing can feel like the natural response when someone you care about starts pulling away. When communication becomes colder, you want answers. When they become distant, you want reassurance. When they stop showing the same level of affection, your mind starts searching for a way to restore what was there before. So you reach out, you explain, understands. You ask what happened, you offer patience. You try to make the connection feel safe again. From your perspective, this can feel like an attempt to save the relationship. Yet psychologically, something more complicated can happen when withdrawal and pursuit repeatedly meet each other. Understands. The important thing is to understand this without blaming either person. The person who chases is usually responding to uncertainty. Distance creates discomfort, and reaching out can temporarily reduce that discomfort. The person who withdraws may also be responding to emotional discomfort. Understands. Closeness can activate feelings they struggle to process, so creating distance can provide temporary relief. Both people may be trying to regulate difficult emotions, but they are regulating those emotions in opposite directions. One moves closer to feel safer. The other moves farther away to feel safer. Understands. The result is a cycle where each person's coping strategy can unintentionally activate the other person's deepest reaction. This is where the pattern becomes powerful. The more the avoidant withdraws, the more uncertainty the other person experiences. The more uncertainty they experience, the stronger the urge to reconnect can become. Understands. They may send another message because the first one received no response. They may explain themselves because they believe something was misunderstood. They may become more affectionate because they believe the avoidant needs reassurance. Understands. They may become more patient because they are afraid that asking for too much will push the person even farther away. Every attempt comes from a desire to restore connection, yet the increased pursuit can sometimes make the avoidant feel even more pressure. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, emotional intensity can feel difficult to manage. Understands. When another person is asking for reassurance, clarity, emotional openness, or immediate connection, the avoidant may experience those needs as demands, even when the other person is communicating them gently. Their instinct can be to create more space. They may become quieter. They may delay responding. They may focus on other parts of life. Understands. They may convince themselves that they need time to think. The more they feel pursued, the stronger the desire for distance can become. Then the other person sees that distance and interprets it as evidence that they need to try harder. This is where both reactions begin feeding each other. The avoidant steps back. The other person moves forward. Understands. The other person moves forward. The avoidant steps back again. Neither person necessarily wakes up wanting to create this dynamic, yet their emotional responses can fit together in a way that keeps the cycle moving. Attachment research offers an important way to understand this difference in emotional regulation. Understands. People with more anxious attachment tendencies can become highly focused on signs of rejection or abandonment and may seek reassurance when connection feels uncertain. People with stronger avoidant tendencies can rely more heavily on emotional deactivation and distance when closeness feels threatening. Understands. These responses can look completely opposite on the surface, but both can function as attempts to manage emotional discomfort. One person tries to reduce uncertainty by moving closer. The other tries to reduce emotional pressure by moving away. This creates one of the most painful misunderstandings in these relationships. Understands. The person pursuing may think, I am showing them that I care. The avoidant may experience that same behavior as pressure. The avoidant may think, I am giving myself space so I can feel calm. The other person may experience that same space as rejection. Understands. Both people can be acting from emotional self-protection while experiencing the other person's behavior as the source of the problem. Over time, the pursuer can become exhausted. They may start monitoring every message, every delay, every change in tone. A short response can feel significant. A missed message can create an entire chain of questions. Understands. Their emotional state becomes connected to the avoidant's availability. Meanwhile, the avoidant can become increasingly comfortable with withdrawal because withdrawal repeatedly produces the space they want. The relationship becomes organized around managing distance instead of building intimacy. Understands. There is also something subtle that happens when the pursuer repeatedly rescues the connection. The avoidant may never fully experience the consequences of their withdrawal. Every time the relationship becomes unstable, the other person repairs it. Every time communication breaks down, the other person restarts it. Understands. Every time distance appears, the other person crosses it. This can create an unconscious expectation that the relationship will somehow repair itself without the avoidant having to take equal responsibility for repairing it. That does not mean the avoidant is consciously taking advantage of the situation. Understands. It means the pattern itself can become self-sustaining. Human beings learn from repeated experiences. When a particular behavior repeatedly produces a familiar outcome, the behavior becomes easier to repeat. Withdrawal followed by pursuit becomes familiar. Pursuit followed by further withdrawal becomes familiar. Understands. Eventually, both people can find themselves reacting automatically rather than making deliberate choices. And this is why chasing does not always create the closeness the pursuer desperately wants. More messages cannot automatically emotional availability. More explanations cannot force vulnerability. Understands. More reassurance cannot make someone ready for intimacy. More patience cannot replace mutual effort. Sometimes the harder one person works to restore connection, the more the other person retreats from the emotional intensity surrounding that connection. Understands. The painful part is that the pursuer can begin believing the solution is to become even better at chasing. They become calmer, more understanding, more available, more forgiving. They lower their expectations. They ask for less. They tolerate longer periods of silence. Understands. They convince themselves that eventually the avoidant will feel safe enough to come closer. Yet the relationship can remain trapped because the very response designed to repair the distance keeps the original pattern alive. Then comes the moment that changes the equation. The person who always pursued decides to step back. Understands. They do not do it to punish anyone. They do it because they are exhausted from carrying a connection that requires constant pursuit. For the first time, the avoidance withdrawal does not produce the familiar response. There is no immediate chase. There is no endless reassurance. There is no emotional rescue waiting on the other side of the distance. Stands, and suddenly the pattern has lost its predictable ending. The avoidant creates space, but this time the other person respects that space. The silence remains silent. The distance remains distance. The person who used to run toward the connection stops running, stands. That is where something psychologically different can begin to happen. Because when the chase disappears, both people are forced to experience the relationship without the familiar reaction that kept the cycle moving. The moment you stop chasing can feel strangely quiet. There is no dramatic announcement. No final speech is required. Stands. You simply stop doing what you have been doing for so long. You stop sending another message after being ignored. You stop searching for the perfect words that might finally make them understand. You stop trying to repair every uncomfortable silence. Stands. You stop taking responsibility for keeping a connection alive when the other person keeps creating distance. From the outside, it may look like nothing has happened. Internally, however, something significant has changed. You have stepped out of the role you were repeatedly playing in the relationship. Stands. This is important because stopping is often misunderstood. It is easy to believe that stepping back is a strategy designed to make someone miss you. It can become tempting to think, I will disappear so they finally realize what they lost. But that mindset keeps your attention focused on their reaction. You are still waiting for them to respond. Stands. You are still measuring the value of your decision through their behavior. Genuine detachment has a different foundation. You stop because the cycle is hurting you. You stop because constantly pursuing someone who keeps withdrawing has started costing you your peace. Stands. You stop because you finally recognize that connection cannot be created by one person carrying the entire emotional responsibility. There is also a difference between a boundary and a silent punishment. Stands. A punishment says, I want you to suffer because you hurt me. A boundary says, I will no longer participate in something that continues to hurt me. The external behavior may look similar because both can involve or distance, but the internal motivation is completely different. One is focused on controlling another person's emotions. Stands. The other is focused on protecting your own emotional health. That distinction matters because the goal is never to make the avoidant panic. The goal is to stop allowing their withdrawal to control your behavior. For the avoidant, this can create an unfamiliar experience. In the past, their distance may have been followed by your pursuit. Stands. They could withdraw and still know that you are emotionally available. They could take space and eventually receive another message. They could remain quiet while knowing that you are probably thinking about the relationship, wondering what happened, and looking for a way to restore contact. Stands. That expectation can become so familiar that the absence of pursuit feels strange when it finally happens. This time there is no immediate message. There is no emotional explanation waiting for them. There is no attempt to convince them that you still care. There is no effort to remove the distance they created. There is simply space. Stands. And space can reveal things that constant communication sometimes hides. When the other person is always reaching toward you, there is very little room to experience their absence. Their presence remains psychologically available even when they are physically or emotionally distant. You may know they are still thinking about you. Stands. You may know another message is coming. You may know that eventually they will try again, but when the pursuit stops, that certainty can disappear. This is where the question can begin to emerge. Are they really gone this time? The question is powerful because it challenges the old expectation. Stands. The avoidant may have experienced previous periods of distance as temporary. The relationship survived them before. The other person returned before. The emotional connection remained available before. But now the familiar response is missing. The person who used to close the gap is no longer closing it. Stands. That does not mean the avoidant instantly becomes overwhelmed with regret. Human emotional responses are far more complicated than that. Some people initially feel relief when the pressure disappears. They may enjoy the space, they may feel calmer, they may convince themselves that the relationship is better left alone. Stands. This can happen because distance may initially reduce the emotional intensity they were trying to escape. Stands. But once the immediate pressure has disappeared, another psychological experience can become possible. They have room to notice the absence itself. They may begin remembering the ordinary things they previously took for granted. The conversations, the attention, the emotional availability, the feeling that someone was there. Stands. The knowledge that they could reach out and receive a response. When those experiences are no longer guaranteed, their emotional significance can become clearer. The silence itself is not magic. Silence does not force someone to love you. It does not guarantee regret. It does not automatically transform an avoidant attachment pattern. Stands. What makes this moment important is the interruption of the familiar cycle. The old sequence was withdrawal followed by pursuit. Now there is withdrawal followed by something different. There is withdrawal followed by acceptance of the distance, stands, and that can create uncertainty on both sides. You may wonder whether they will ever come back. They may wonder whether you have finally moved on. You may question whether stopping was the right decision. They may question whether they pushed the relationship too far. For the first time, neither person has complete control over what happens next. Stands. This is also where the person who stopped chasing begins to experience their own psychological shift. At first, the silence can feel uncomfortable. You may reach for your phone out of habit. You may feel the urge to explain yourself one more time. You may wonder whether a small message could reopen the connection. Stands. But every time you resist the urge to return to the old pattern, you create evidence that you can survive the distance without abandoning yourself. The relationship is no longer being maintained through your constant pursuit. The avoidant now has space to decide whether they actually want to move toward you. Stands. You also have space to decide whether you still want the relationship in the form it previously existed. That is the deeper change. Before, the question was mostly about how to bring them closer. Stands. Now the question becomes whether both people are willing to create a connection where closeness does not depend on one person chasing and the other person retreating. And somewhere inside that new silence, the old assumption begins to lose its power. They thought you would always come back because until this moment you always had. Stands. But now they are encountering something they have never had to fully face before. Your absence is no longer a temporary pause inside the same cycle. You have stepped outside the cycle itself, and they can no longer assume that your love will always be waiting exactly where they left it. Stands. There is a major difference between temporary distance and genuine loss. When someone pulls away while knowing that you are still emotionally available, the meaning of that distance can feel very different. Stands. They may become quiet, take space, reduce communication, or disappear for a period of time. Yet somewhere in the background there can still be an assumption that you are there. The relationship has not truly disappeared. Your attention is still available. Your concern is still available. Your willingness to understand is still available. Stands. Even when you are not speaking, your emotional presence can remain predictable. That can make distance feel safer because the connection still exists underneath it. This is where the dynamic begins to change when you genuinely step away. Your absence becomes real when the other person can no longer depend on the old pattern. Stands. They may have expected another message, another attempt to reconnect, another explanation, another moment when you would reach toward them and make the distance easier to tolerate. But this time, that response does not arrive. The silence continues. The emotional availability they once assumed would always be there becomes uncertain. Stands. For someone who became accustomed to your presence, that uncertainty can carry a completely different emotional weight. Your attention may have been easier to notice after it disappeared. While you were always checking in, your attention could become part of the background of the relationship. Stands. It was there so consistently that its value could become difficult to recognize in the moment. The same can happen with emotional availability. When someone knows they can speak to you whenever they decide they are ready, they may rarely consider what it would feel like if that access disappeared. Your willingness to listen may have seemed ordinary. Stands. Your patience may have seemed endless. Your ability to understand their complicated emotions may have seemed like something they could return to whenever they wanted. Then suddenly, there is no guarantee. This does not mean every avoidant person immediately becomes desperate. That would turn a complicated psychological pattern into a simple formula. Stands. Some people may feel relief first. Some may continue their lives without reaching out. Some may feel curious. Some may begin missing the relationship. Some may experience regret much later. Stands. Response depends on the individual, their attachment pattern, their emotional awareness, the history of the relationship, and their willingness to face uncomfortable feelings. Important psychological change is deeper than whether they immediately contact you. The predictable response has disappeared. Stands. That matters because relationships are shaped by patterns. When one person repeatedly withdraws and the other repeatedly remains available, the withdrawal can become part of the relationship's normal rhythm. Stands. The avoidant can create distance without experiencing the full emotional meaning of that distance because the other person continues to provide a bridge back to connection. Once that bridge disappears, the emotional environment changes. They may begin remembering details that felt insignificant before. Stands. The way you listened without immediately judging them. The way you remembered small things they had told you. The way you tried to understand their silence instead of immediately attacking them for it. The consistency of your presence. The fact that you were willing to have difficult conversations. Stands. The comfort of knowing someone cared even during periods when they struggled to express themselves. Sometimes absence makes ordinary things emotionally visible. This is especially relevant because attachment avoidance has been associated with lower feelings of connectedness and reduced reliance on relationship support. Stands. A person who is accustomed to managing emotional needs independently may place less value on interpersonal support while it is available. They may genuinely believe they are fine without depending on anyone. Yet independence can feel different when the person who provided emotional connection is no longer available on demand. Stands. There is an important distinction here. Missing someone's presence does not automatically mean someone is ready to create a healthy relationship with them. A person can miss you and still struggle with intimacy. They can recognize your value and still fear emotional closeness. Stands. They can regret losing access to you and still lack the skills required to repair the relationship. This is why absence should never be treated as a guaranteed psychological trick that makes an avoidant return. The deeper effect is that absence removes certainty. Before, the avoidant could tell themselves that the relationship was still there. Stands. They might have assumed that you were upset but still available. They might have believed that enough time would pass and you would eventually reach out. That assumption can create emotional comfort even during separation. But once you stop participating in the old cycle, the future becomes less predictable. Stands. They may begin asking themselves questions they previously had little reason to ask. Did I take this person for granted? Did I push too far? Were they serious when they said they were tired? Have they finally accepted that this relationship cannot continue in the same way? Did I mistake their patience for permanent availability? Stands. Could they actually move forward without me? Stands. These questions are significant because they shift the emotional responsibility. Before, you were doing much of the work of keeping the connection alive. Now the other person has to confront the reality of what their distance created. They can no longer assume that you will automatically repair the consequences of their withdrawal. Stands. And this is where genuine loss begins to feel different from temporary distance. Temporary distance still contains an expectation of return. Genuine loss introduces uncertainty about whether there will be a return at all. The difference is subtle at first, but psychologically it can be profound. Stands. When someone realizes that the person they could always count on may actually continue living without them, the relationship can suddenly become visible from a completely different perspective. Your absence becomes real when your life continues without waiting for their decision. Stands. You are no longer standing emotionally at the same door, hoping they will eventually open it. You are moving forward. You are creating distance for your own reasons. You are allowing their choices to belong to them and your choices to belong to you. Stands. And for the first time, they may have to experience the possibility that the person they thought would always be there was never guaranteed to remain. One of the most unexpected parts of this dynamic is what can happen immediately after you stop chasing. You might expect the other person to suddenly panic, miss you, or realize what they lost. Stands. Yet the first emotion can be something completely different. They may feel relief. The pressure has disappeared. The repeated messages have stopped. The emotional conversations have become quiet. There is no longer someone asking for answers, requesting reassurance, or trying to restore closeness. Stands. For a person who tends to experience emotional intimacy as overwhelming, that sudden space can feel calming at first. This is where it becomes important to separate relief from indifference. Relief does not automatically mean they never cared. It does not prove that the relationship meant nothing to them. Stands. It can simply mean that the immediate emotional pressure has been removed. A person with strong avoidant tendencies may have been experiencing closeness as something demanding or emotionally intense. When the other person stops pursuing, the intensity decreases. Stands. Their nervous system may register the change as safety because they have more room to regulate themselves without feeling responsible for another person's emotional needs. This can be difficult for the person who stopped chasing to accept. Stands. You may think, I finally stepped away and they seem perfectly fine. You may see their silence and interpret it as proof that your absence means nothing. You may expect some visible reaction and become confused when nothing happens. But emotional processing does not always happen at the same speed for both people. Stands. The person who has been pursuing may experience the loss immediately because they have been emotionally engaged throughout the entire cycle. The person who has been withdrawing may experience the relationship differently. Distance can initially make difficult feelings easier to push aside. Stands. Avoidant attachment is often associated with deactivating strategies. These strategies can involve suppressing emotional needs, reducing dependence on others, and creating psychological distance when vulnerability becomes uncomfortable. A person using these strategies may become very good at telling themselves that they are fine. Stands. They may focus on work, routine, hobbies, responsibilities, or other parts of life. They may convince themselves that the relationship was too complicated, or that walking away was the right choice. They may feel calmer precisely because the emotional intensity has decreased. That calm can be real. But calm is not necessarily closure. Stands. This is where the story becomes more complicated. When the pressure disappears, the person may finally have enough emotional space to notice what the pressure was covering. During the relationship, their attention may have been focused on escaping discomfort. Understands. They may have been thinking about why the other person wanted more closeness, why another conversation was happening, or why they needed more space. Once the pursuit stops, there is no immediate emotional demand competing for their attention. The mind can become quieter, and in that quieter space, other feelings can begin to surface. Understands. Curiosity can appear first. They may wonder why you have become so quiet. They may check whether you have reached out. They may think about whether you are still emotionally available. They may become curious about what changed inside you. The absence can become something they notice because the old pattern has disappeared. Understands. Then memories can begin appearing differently. A conversation that once felt ordinary may suddenly feel important. A small gesture may become more meaningful. A moment of patience may stand out. The emotional availability they previously experienced as normal can become visible because it is no longer present. Understands. This does not mean every memory leads to regret, but it creates an opportunity for reflection that was difficult to access while the relationship was filled with pressure and pursuit. Missing someone can also emerge slowly. Missing someone is different from needing someone. Understands. A person can miss your presence without immediately wanting emotional intimacy. They can miss the comfort of your attention while still struggling with vulnerability. They can miss the connection while feeling afraid of returning to the emotional intensity that originally caused them to withdraw. Understands. This contradiction is important because it explains why an avoidant person can appear to move while still carrying unresolved feelings about the relationship. Loneliness can enter the picture as well. When you are constantly available, loneliness may have been easier to avoid. Understands. The person could maintain a strong sense of independence while still having access to your emotional presence. Once that access disappears, independence can feel different. Understands. The absence of another person's attention can become noticeable during quiet moments, difficult days, celebrations, or ordinary routines when they instinctively expect someone to be there. Regret can follow, but regret also has different levels. Someone may regret losing your attention. They may regret how they handled the relationship. Understands. They may regret pushing you away. They may regret assuming you would always return. These are different experiences. Genuine regret involves recognizing your own role in what happened. That recognition can be uncomfortable because it requires the person to move beyond the belief that the relationship simply faded on its own. Understands. Confusion can also become part of the process. The avoidant may wonder why they wanted distance so strongly before, and why they now notice the absence so intensely. They may feel relieved one day and lonely the next. They may want contact and then feel the urge to retreat again. Understands. This emotional contradiction can happen because wanting connection and fearing vulnerability can exist at the same time. That is why stopping the chase does not create one predictable reaction. It removes the pressure and allows the person's own emotional process to become visible. Understands. Without constant pursuit from you, there is less external stimulation directing their attention. They have more space to experience whatever is actually underneath the withdrawal. For some people, that may be simple relief. Understands. For others, curiosity slowly becomes missing, missing becomes reflection, and reflection eventually becomes an uncomfortable awareness of what their distance may have cost them. And once the initial relief fades into ordinary silence, a different question can begin forming inside them. The question is no longer simply why you stopped reaching out. Understands. It becomes something much more personal. What did I actually feel about this person before I pushed them away? That question can take someone into territory they were able to avoid while you were still doing the emotional work of keeping the connection alive. Understands. When someone has been consistently available, their presence can become psychologically predictable. You may have been the person who answered quickly, checked in after an argument, asked whether everything was okay, or reached out when the relationship became quiet. Your presence became part of the emotional environment. Understands. The avoidant could step away and still have a sense that you were somewhere nearby, emotionally invested and ready to reconnect. That certainty can make a person's presence feel almost invisible, because there is little reason to question whether it will still be there tomorrow. Understands. Then you stop and suddenly the familiar pattern contains a missing piece. At first, the change may seem small. There is simply no message, no follow-up, no attempt to reopen the conversation, no explanation about why you have become quiet. Understands. Yet the absence of these familiar behaviors can gradually become noticeable because the brain is highly responsive to changes in expected patterns. When something repeatedly happens and then suddenly stops, attention naturally moves toward the change. Understands. The silence becomes more noticeable precisely because there used to be something predictable on the other side of it. This can create a strange psychological reversal. Before, you were probably the person wondering why they were quiet. You were looking at your phone and wondering whether they would respond. Understands. You were trying to understand what their distance meant. Now the uncertainty can move in the opposite direction. They may begin wondering why you have stopped reaching out. The person who once experienced your attention as predictable may suddenly be faced with questions they never had to consider. Why have they stopped? Did they finally move on? Understands. Do they still care? Did I push them too far? Were they actually serious when they said they could not keep doing this? These questions do not necessarily appear all at once. They can emerge slowly, especially during quiet moments when there is no longer an emotional conversation demanding attention. Understands. The absence can become more noticeable as time passes because there is no familiar action correcting it. In the past, distance may have been followed by your attempt to reconnect. This time, distance remains distance. That is what makes silence psychologically different from a dramatic confrontation. A confrontation gives the other person information. Understands. They know you are upset. They know you want an answer. They know you're still emotionally engaged. They may feel reassured by the fact that you are still trying to repair the connection. Silence removes some of that certainty. They have fewer clues about what you are thinking, feeling, or planning to do next. Understands. For someone who has become accustomed to controlling closeness through distance, this uncertainty can feel unfamiliar. They may have felt comfortable stepping away because they understood the pattern. You would eventually return. You would probably ask how they were doing. You would probably try to understand. Understands. They could take their space without fully confronting the possibility of permanent loss. Once you stop participating, that assumption becomes less reliable. The mind tends to notice missing information. When an expected response does not arrive, people can begin filling the gap with possibilities. Understands. The avoidant may start reviewing previous conversations. They may remember moments when you asked for more consistency. They may remember times when you told them their distance was hurting you. They may reconsider statements they previously dismissed. They may wonder whether your patience finally reached its limit. Understands. This does not mean silence automatically causes someone to become obsessed or desperate. That would be an unrealistic promise. Some people will continue avoiding the relationship. Some will remain emotionally detached. Some may feel relief for a long time. Understands. Others may begin thinking about the relationship in ways they never did while you were still pursuing them. The important point is that the old certainty has been removed, and the person's response to that uncertainty depends on their emotional awareness and willingness to reflect. Understands. There is also a subtle difference between knowing someone is upset and realizing someone has actually changed their behavior. If you tell someone, "I am tired of chasing you," they hear your words. If you continue chasing after saying those words, the old pattern remains intact. Understands. But when your behavior changes, the message becomes much harder to dismiss. You are no longer explaining the boundary, you are living it. That can make your silence feel different from previous periods of quiet. Before, the silence may have been part of the push and pull. Both people knew there would eventually be another attempt to reconnect. Understands. Now the silence can represent a genuine change in participation. You are no longer waiting for the same response. You are allowing the distance to exist without immediately trying to eliminate it. And this can cause the avoidant to notice things that were previously easy to overlook. They may notice how often you used to reach out. Understands. They may realize how much emotional energy you invested in maintaining contact. They may remember how quickly you responded when they needed support. They may recognize that the relationship had a level of consistency they rarely acknowledged because it was always available. Your absence can make your previous presence easier to measure. Understands. A person may only understand how much emotional space someone occupied after that space becomes empty. The conversations that once seemed ordinary can feel different in memory. The attention that once seemed automatic can become something they realize they depended upon. Understands. Even the knowledge that someone cared can become meaningful when there is no longer a guarantee that the care will remain available. This is where the question, "do they still care?" can become more complicated. They may wonder whether your silence means your feelings disappeared, or whether you simply stopped accepting the old dynamic. Understands. They may wonder whether you are waiting for them, or whether you have started building a life that no longer revolves around their decisions. They may wonder whether there is still a place for them in your life, or whether the opportunity they assumed would remain available has quietly closed. The uncertainty itself can change attention. Understands. When you were chasing, their attention was often directed toward your pursuit. They could respond to your messages, avoid them, or ask for more space. Now there is no immediate pursuit to react to. Their attention has to find the missing piece on its own. Understands. And when the person who was always reaching out suddenly becomes silent, the absence can become a question that keeps returning. Why did they finally stop? One of the deepest realizations that can emerge when you stop chasing is the understanding that your presence was never guaranteed. Understands. The avoidant may have become comfortable with the idea that you would remain emotionally available regardless of how much distance they created. They may have assumed that another conversation would happen, another message would arrive, and another opportunity to reconnect would appear. Yet your presence was always a choice. You chose to stay. Understands. You chose to listen. You chose to be patient. You chose to keep trying when the relationship became difficult. Those choices can become so consistent that another person begins experiencing them as something permanent, even though they were never promised. Your love was a choice. Your patience was a choice. Your availability was a choice. Understands. Your willingness to understand someone who struggled with closeness was a choice. None of those things were obligations. You were giving them because you cared. You believed the connection was worth protecting. You may have seen the person's fears beneath their distance and decided to give them more time. Understands. You may have recognized that their withdrawal was connected to emotional discomfort rather than simply assuming they did not care. You may have repeatedly told yourself that if you remained calm, patient, and understanding, eventually the relationship would become easier. Understands. Over time, however, giving can become so familiar that the person receiving it stops recognizing how valuable it actually is. This is where the emotional meaning of your absence becomes different. When you were always available, the avoidant did not have to fully confront the possibility of losing you. Understands. They could focus on the immediate discomfort of closeness and create distance to feel safer. The long-term consequences remained somewhere in the background because your previous behavior suggested that the relationship would survive. Even when you were hurt, you came back. Even when you felt exhausted, you tried again. Understands. Even when you felt rejected, you looked for a way to understand them. That consistency may have created a sense of security that was never consciously acknowledged. Then you stop. Suddenly, the relationship can no longer operate on the assumption that you will endlessly tolerate distance. The old pattern loses its certainty. Understands. The avoidant may still have the same fears, the same habits, and the same need for space, but one important element has changed. You are no longer automatically available to absorb the consequences of those behaviors. They may have expected you to remain at the emotional edge of the relationship while they decided when to move closer. Understands. Now you have stepped away from that position. This can be confronting because it introduces a reality that distance can sometimes hide. Relationships have consequences. People can reach a point where love is still present, yet participation in the same pattern becomes impossible. Understands. Someone can understand your fears and still refuse to keep being hurt by them. Someone can respect your need for space and still decide that they need consistency. Someone can care about you deeply and still walk away from a relationship that repeatedly leaves them feeling unwanted. That is why stopping the chase should never be framed as a tactic. Understands. If the only reason you stop is to make the avoidant return, then you are still emotionally dependent on their reaction. You are still waiting for them to prove that the strategy worked. Genuine change happens when you stop because you recognize that your life cannot remain organized around another person's willingness to come closer. Understands. The avoidant may eventually realize that the person they assumed would always remain available was actually making a series of choices. Every message was a choice. Every attempt to repair the relationship was a choice. Every time you forgave, listened, waited, and tried again, you were choosing the relationship. Understands. The fact that you made those choices repeatedly did not turn them into permanent guarantees. This realization can become especially powerful when the avoidant remembers how easily they were able to step away because they trusted that you would remain. Understands. They may begin seeing a painful difference between having access to someone and truly valuing their presence. Access can feel permanent when it is always available. Value becomes clearer when access is no longer guaranteed. They may remember the person who kept asking for communication, the person who wanted clarity. Understands. The person who tried to understand their silence, the person who kept believing there was something worth saving. Perhaps those requests once felt overwhelming, perhaps they seemed like pressure. But after the person stops making those requests, the silence can reveal something unexpected. Understands. The absence of pressure also means the absence of the person who was creating that pressure. There is a strange paradox here. The thing the avoidant wanted may have been space, but space can eventually become the place where they recognize what was attached to the closeness they were trying to escape. Understands. They wanted distance from the emotional intensity, but distance also created separation from the person providing connection, support, attention, and care. Those two realities can exist together. And this is where the title becomes more than a dramatic statement. Understands. They thought you would chase them forever because your previous behavior had taught them that distance would always be followed by your return. They believed the connection could withstand endless withdrawal because you had repeatedly demonstrated your willingness to remain. Understands. Yet they may eventually discover that your love had limits because your love existed alongside self-respect. You were willing to stay, but you were never required to stay. You were willing to understand, but you were never required to tolerate the same pain forever. Understands. You were willing to give another chance, but you were never required to give unlimited chances. You were willing to love them, but you were never required to abandon yourself to prove it. And once that becomes clear, the old dynamic begins losing its power. They can no longer assume that every withdrawal will be followed by another pursuit. Understands. They can no longer rely on the idea that your emotional availability will remain untouched regardless of how they behave. For the first time, they may have to recognize that the person they thought would always chase them was actually choosing to stay every single time, until one day you chose differently. Understands. There comes a point in some relationships where another explanation no longer creates a different result. You have already explained how their distance affects you. You have already said that the silence hurts. You have already asked for more consistency, more clarity, or more emotional presence. Understands. You may have carefully chosen your words because you wanted them to understand rather than feel attacked. You may have explained your intentions again and again, hoping that the right conversation would finally make the pattern visible to them. Understands. Yet when the same behavior continues after countless conversations, another explanation can simply become another round of the same cycle. You pursue because you want understanding. They withdraw because the emotional intensity feels uncomfortable. You explain because their withdrawal creates uncertainty. Understands. They create even more distance because the explanation feels like pressure. You become more emotional because you are trying to be heard. They become more detached because they are trying to escape the intensity. Then the distance becomes greater, and you find yourself thinking about what else you could say to make them understand. Understands. This is how communication can become circular. The words change, but the pattern remains. Silence in this context is different because it changes your behavior rather than attempting to control theirs. You are no longer trying to find the perfect sentence that will produce a particular response. Understands. You are no longer searching for a way to make someone understand your value. You are no longer trying to persuade another person into emotional availability. You step back and allow their actions to exist without constantly explaining them for them. This can feel uncomfortable because explanations give you the illusion of control. Understands. When someone misunderstands you, explaining yourself feels productive. When someone withdraws, reaching out feels like an action you can take. You can write another message. You can clarify another point. You can explain that you are only asking for consistency. You can tell them that you understand their fears. Understands. You can promise that you will give them space. Yet eventually you may realize that you have been spending enormous emotional energy trying to manage another person's reaction. Stepping back removes you from that responsibility. You cannot make someone communicate. You cannot make someone become emotionally available. Understands. You cannot make someone confront their attachment patterns. You cannot make someone recognize the impact of their behavior simply by explaining it more clearly. At some point, their behavior has to become their responsibility. This is why silence can sometimes communicate something that another explanation cannot. Understands. Your words may say, "I cannot continue like this," while your actions continue participating in the same cycle. Your behavior says something different when you actually step back. There is no threat. There is no dramatic announcement. There is simply a change in what you are willing to participate in. Understands. The avoidant now has the opportunity to show what they actually want without being constantly pulled toward the relationship. If they care about maintaining the connection, they have room to move toward it. If they need space, they have that space. If they choose to remain distant, their choice becomes clearer. Understands. You are no longer filling every silence with your own effort. Understands. That can be difficult because uncertainty remains. You may still wonder whether they will reach out. You may still miss them. You may still feel the urge to send one final message. But the purpose of stepping back is not to create a psychological reaction in them. It is to create emotional clarity for you. Understands. There is a profound difference between asking, "How do I make them come back?" and asking, "Why am I willing to keep abandoning myself to make someone stay?" The first question keeps your attention focused on the other person's behavior. The second brings your attention back to your own life. That shift can change everything. Understands. When your focus is on making the avoidant return, every silence becomes a strategy. You wonder how long you should wait. You wonder whether you should post something. You wonder whether they are thinking about you. You analyze their behavior for signs. You measure your progress by whether they contact you. Understands. Even your decision to step back remains connected to their reaction. When your focus becomes self-respect, the questions become differful. Am I being treated consistently? Am I expressing my needs clearly? Am I accepting behavior that repeatedly hurts me? Am I allowing someone else's fear of intimacy to determine how I feel about myself? Understands. Am I building a life that continues whether this person returns or remains distant? Those questions create a different kind of strength. Silence also gives you the opportunity to observe rather than react. When you are constantly pursuing, every action becomes emotional. A delayed message creates anxiety. A warm response creates hope, stands. A cold response creates disappointment. Your emotional state will rise and falls according to their behavior. Once you step back, you gain enough distance to observe the entire pattern rather than getting trapped inside every individual moment. You begin noticing consistency. You notice whether they initiate contact or stands. You notice whether they take responsibility. You notice whether their behavior changes. You notice whether they only return when they feel lonely. You notice whether they can maintain closeness once the initial emotional intensity disappears. You notice whether their actions actually match their words or stands. And this is something another long explanation cannot accomplish. You can tell someone what you need, but their behavior reveals whether they are willing to meet you there. You can explain your pain, but their response reveals how seriously they take it. Stands. You can tell them that you are tired of chasing, but stepping away allows you to discover whether they will ever move toward you without being pursued. Stands. The silence becomes powerful because it stops carrying the relationship for both people. You are no longer doing all the emotional labor required to keep the connection alive. You are allowing reality to reveal itself, and perhaps the most important change happens inside you. You stop trying to convince someone to choose you. Stands. You stop believing that one more conversation will finally unlock the person you hope they can become. You stop treating their distance as a problem you are responsible for solving. You allow them to have their emotions, their fears, their choices, and their consequences. You also allow yourself to have yours. You can care without chasing. Stands. You can love without pleading. You can understand their wounds without volunteering to be wounded by the same pattern forever. You can leave space without waiting beside the door. And when you reach that point, your silence is no longer a message designed for them. It becomes a decision you have made for yourself. Stands. The avoidant may come back, but that cannot be the promise of this story. There is no psychological formula that can guarantee another person will return simply because you stop chasing. Some people come back quickly. Some return after weeks or months. Some reach out only when they begin feeling the absence more strongly. Stands. Some recognize what they lost after a long period of reflection. Others never return at all. Human relationships are far too complicated for a single behavior to produce the same result every time. The important question is therefore not whether your silence will make the avoidant come back. Stands. The more important question is what happens to you when you stop making their return the center of your emotional life. This distinction matters because it is easy to turn healing into another form of waiting. You may tell yourself that you are finally stepping back, but secretly you are watching the phone. Stands. You are wondering whether they noticed your absence. You are checking whether they have reached out. You are interpreting every small sign. You may even feel disappointed when several days pass without hearing from them. At that point, you are physically distant but emotionally still standing in the same place. The chase has simply changed form. Stands. Instead of chasing them with messages, you are chasing the possibility of their return inside your own mind. That can keep you trapped for much longer than you realize. You may begin believing that your value will be confirmed when they finally come back. Their return becomes evidence that you mattered. Stands. Their message becomes proof that they regretted losing you. Their attempt to reconnect becomes the validation you were waiting for. Yet your worth existed before their message, during their silence, and after their decision. Another person's ability to recognize your value does not create that value. Stands. There is also an important reality that deserves attention. Someone can miss you and still struggle to build a healthy relationship with you. Someone can regret losing you and still repeat the same behaviors that caused the separation. Someone can reach out because they feel lonely without being ready for emotional intimacy. Stands. Someone can say that they have changed while their behavior remains familiar. Returning to the relationship and becoming capable of sustaining the relationship are two completely different things. This is where attachment psychology becomes especially important. Stands. Insecure attachment patterns have been associated with difficulties in relationship functioning, satisfaction, communication, and emotional support. But these patterns do not determine the future of every individual relationship. People can grow. People can develop greater emotional awareness. People can learn healthier ways of communicating. Stands. People can work through fear, vulnerability, and old protective strategies. Yet growth requires more than missing someone. It requires awareness, responsibility, and consistent behavior. Stands. So if the avoidant returns, the question should never be only, did they come back? A more useful question is, what are they bringing back with them? Are they bringing the same uncertainty, the same disappearing acts, the same emotional distance, the same inability to discuss difficult feelings? Stands. Or are they showing something different through their behavior? Are they communicating more openly? Are they taking responsibility for their part in the relationship? Are they respecting your boundaries? Are they willing to tolerate emotional closeness without immediately creating distance? Understands. A return can be emotionally powerful because it may awaken all the feelings you were trying to process. The moment you see their name again, memories can come rushing back. Hope can return quickly. The pain of separation can suddenly feel worth it. You may begin remembering the best moments and forgetting the reasons you stepped away. Understands. This is why emotional clarity matters before deciding whether someone deserves another place in your life. Understands. You do not have to reject someone simply because they once struggled with closeness. People can change, but you also do not have to accept someone simply because they finally realize they miss you. Missing you is an emotion. Building a relationship with you is a responsibility. The real victory, then, is not making the avoidant chase you. Understands. It is becoming emotionally free from the need for them to chase you at all. When you reach that point, their return becomes information rather than validation. Their silence becomes information too. Their actions become something you can observe without allowing them to determine how you feel about yourself. Understands. This is a major shift because the old question was centered around them. Will they come back? When will they contact me? Do they still care? Are they thinking about me? These questions can consume enormous amounts of emotional energy because every answer depends on someone else's behavior. Understands. The healthier question becomes, what kind of relationship do I want to participate in? That question puts you back in your own life. Understands. You can still care about them. You can still hope they heal. You can still remember the good moments. You can still acknowledge that the connection mattered. None of that requires you to wait indefinitely. Love does not demand permanent emotional availability to someone who cannot offer consistency in return. Understands. There is also freedom in accepting that you may never receive the ending you wanted. The avoidant may never explain everything. They may never fully understand how their behavior affected you. They may never return with the apology you hoped to hear. They may never realize the full value of what they lost. Understands. That can hurt, but it does not have to keep your life suspended. Your healing cannot depend on another person's awakening. Your peace cannot depend on another person's regret. Your worth cannot depend on another person's return. And once you understand that, the entire meaning of stopping changes. Understands. You are no longer stepping back so they will finally notice you. You are stepping back because you have finally noticed yourself. You notice your exhaustion. You notice your needs. You notice the amount of energy you spent trying to keep someone close. You notice how often their distance made you question your own worth. Understands. You notice that you deserve a relationship where connection is created by two people moving toward each other. So yes, the avoidant may come back, but if they do, let their behavior tell you what their words cannot. And if they never return, let that absence teach you something just as valuable. Understands. Your life does not become less meaningful because someone chose distance. Their reaction is no longer the measure of your worth. The moment you understand that, their return can be welcomed without desperation, and their absence can be accepted without losing yourself. Understands. If the avoidant does come back, the most important thing is to slow down and watch what happens next. A return can feel powerful because it touches the part of you that spent so long hoping for reconnection. Seeing their name appear on your phone can bring back memories, hope, excitement, and even a sense of relief. Understands. You may feel that everything you wanted has finally happened, but coming back is not the same as changing. A person can return because they miss you, feel lonely, feel regret, or want to reconnect with something familiar. None of those reasons automatically mean they are ready to build a healthier relationship. A message is not commitment. Understands. Someone can send a heartfelt message at midnight and still struggle to communicate consistently the next morning. Someone can say, "I miss you," while remaining unable to discuss the problems that cause the distance. Someone can tell you that they have been thinking about you without having any clear understanding of what needs to change. Understands. Words can open a door, but behavior tells you whether the person is actually prepared to walk through it. This is why the first thing to watch is consistency. Do they communicate clearly over time, or do they become warm for a few days and then disappear again? Understands. Do they reach out only when they feel lonely, or do they make a genuine effort to maintain connection? Do they show interest in your life, your feelings, and your needs? Are they willing to have conversations that feel uncomfortable, or do they retreat as soon as emotional closeness returns? Understands. A single good conversation can feel meaningful, but a pattern of consistent behavior is far more revealing. Responsibility is another important sign. If they return, listen carefully to how they talk about what happened. Do they acknowledge their part in the relationship dynamic? Do they recognize the effect their withdrawal had on you? Understands. Are they able to discuss their behavior without blaming you for their reactions? Understands. Someone who has genuinely reflected may be able to say in their own way, "I understand that my distance hurt you, and I see how my actions contributed to what happened." Someone who has not reflected may simply say, You were too demanding. You expected too much, or you should have given me more space. The difference is subtle but significant. Understands. Responsibility looks inward. Deflection always looks outward. Boundaries also become extremely important when someone returns. If you previously accepted behavior that left you anxious, confused, or emotionally exhausted, their return should not automatically reopen the same level of access. You are allowed to move slowly. You are allowed to observe. Understands. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to say that certain behaviors can no longer be part of the relationship. A healthy reconnection has room for boundaries because boundaries create clarity. If someone becomes distant again simply because you have standards, the old pattern may already be returning. Understands. Emotional conversations provide another important test. Avoidant patterns can involve discomfort with vulnerability, emotional dependence, and intense relational conversations. So if someone genuinely wants to build something different, there needs to be a growing ability to remain present when emotions become difficult. Understands. They do not have to become perfectly expressive overnight. Change rarely happens that quickly. But there should be some willingness to stay engaged rather than immediately escaping whenever the conversation becomes uncomfortable. This is where apologies can also be misunderstood. Understands. An apology can be meaningful, but an apology by itself does not repair a relationship. Repair requires behavior after the apology. If someone says they are sorry for disappearing, then continues disappearing, the words have little practical value. Understands. If they apologize for avoiding difficult conversations and then begin making an effort to communicate, that is different. The apology becomes connected to action. Chemistry can create another trap. When two people reconnect after distance, the emotional intensity can feel incredibly strong. Understands. The reunion may feel deeper because both people have experienced the pain of separation. You may feel an immediate rush of closeness. Old attraction can return quickly, but chemistry does not automatically create emotional security. Strong feelings can exist inside an unstable relationship. Understands. The intensity of the reunion should therefore be separated from the quality of the relationship being rebuilt. Look at what happens after the emotional excitement settles. Do they still communicate? Do they still make an effort? Do they still respect your boundaries? Do they remain present when conflict appears? Do they make room for your needs? Understands. Do they allow you to express disappointment without becoming distant? Do they show consistency when there is nothing dramatic happening? Those ordinary moments can reveal far more than a powerful reunion. Another important sign is whether they are willing to build something different rather than simply restart what existed before. Understands. Returning to the same relationship without changing the underlying pattern often produces the same outcome. If the old dynamic was withdrawal followed by pursuit, a healthy relationship requires both people to respond differently. The avoidant needs to become more willing to communicate and tolerate closeness. Understands. The other person needs to become less willing to chase, overfunction, or carry the entire relationship alone. Both sides have something to change. This does not mean demanding perfection. Human beings have difficult days. People become overwhelmed. Communication can still be imperfect. Someone can need space without abandoning the relationship. Understands. Someone can struggle with vulnerability without being incapable of growth. The difference is whether the person can communicate those struggles and return to the relationship with responsibility rather than repeatedly disappearing and expecting you to repair everything. Patterns reveal this over time. A promise tells you what someone hopes to do. Understands. A pattern tells you what they repeatedly choose to do. A message tells you that they are thinking about you. Consistency tells you that they are willing to invest. An apology tells you that they recognize something went wrong. Changed behavior tells you that they are doing something about it. Missing you tells you that your absence affected them. Understands. Emotional availability tells you that they can actually participate in closeness. That is why if the avoidant comes back, you do not have to rush. You do not have to punish them. You do not have to immediately give them the same access they had before. You can simply observe. Understands. Let time reveal whether this is a temporary emotional return or the beginning of a genuine change. Because the real question is never simply whether they came back. The real question is whether the person who came back is capable of creating a relationship that feels different from the one you had to leave. Understands. At some point, the most important part of this story stops being about the avoidant and starts being about you. It is natural to spend hours trying to understand why someone pulled away. You may study their messages, remember their behavior, analyze their silence, and search for explanations that make the relationship easier to understand. Understands. You may wonder whether they were afraid of intimacy, whether they cared, whether they were overwhelmed, or whether they simply did not know how to express what they felt. Those questions can be useful for understanding a pattern, but there is another question that can take you much deeper. Why did their withdrawal make you work harder? Understands. That question can feel uncomfortable because chasing often begins from a place that looks like love. You were trying to save something that mattered to you. You were trying to communicate. You were trying to prove that you were safe, patient, understanding, and willing to stay. Understands. You may have believed that if you could just explain yourself properly, they would finally understand what you were offering. If you could remain calm enough, patient enough, loving enough, perhaps they would stop running. The problem begins when your effort slowly turns into a measurement of your worth. Understands. Their distance may have made you question yourself. Understands. Instead of thinking, this person is struggling with closeness, you may have started thinking, maybe I am asking for too much. Instead of thinking their withdrawal belongs to their emotional pattern, you may have wondered, why am I not enough for them? Instead of recognizing that someone else's inability to offer consistency can exist independently of your value, you may have turned their behavior into a judgment about yourself. Stands. That is where the cycle becomes painful. The avoidant pulls away. You feel rejected. You work harder. They create more distance. You become more anxious. You try harder again. Eventually, their behavior becomes a mirror in which you keep searching for something wrong with yourself. You begin changing your communication style. Stands. You become careful about what you say. You stop asking certain questions because you are afraid of pushing them away. You reduce your needs. You give more space. You accept longer periods of silence. You become increasingly understanding of their fears while becoming less understanding of your own emotional needs. Understands. And slowly you can lose sight of an important truth. Understanding someone does not require you to abandon yourself. You can understand why a person withdraws and still recognize that their withdrawal hurts you. You can understand patterns and still decide that the relationship does not meet your needs. Understands. You can have compassion for someone's emotional wounds without making yourself responsible for healing those wounds. Their history may explain their behavior, but an explanation does not automatically make the behavior healthy for you. This is why the deeper question is so powerful. Why was I willing to keep chasing someone who kept pulling away? Understands. Perhaps you were hoping that persistence would finally produce security. Perhaps every time they returned, you experienced a rush of relief that made the relationship feel worth fighting for again. Perhaps you became attached to the possibility of who the relationship could become, rather than the reality of what it repeatedly was. Understands. Perhaps their occasional closeness made the distance feel temporary, so you kept waiting for the next moment when everything would feel good again. There can also be a deeper fear underneath the chase. Sometimes the fear is not simply losing the person, it is what their rejection seems to say about you. Understands. If they leave, you may fear that you were not lovable enough. If they choose someone else, you may fear that someone else possessed something you lacked. If they remain emotionally distant, you may keep trying to prove that you deserve to be chosen. Understands. But love is not supposed to be an examination where you keep submitting evidence until someone finally gives you a passing grade. You do not become more worthy because someone finally commits to you. You do not become less worthy because someone cannot handle intimacy. You do not need to perform emotional perfection to deserve consistency. Understands. This realization can completely change how you view the relationship. Instead of spending all your energy decoding their behavior, you begin examining your own reactions. What did their silence trigger inside you? Why did uncertainty feel unbearable? Why did you feel responsible for repairing every rupture? Understands. Why did their distance make you move closer instead of allowing their behavior to provide information? These questions are not about blaming yourself. They are about understanding yourself. The goal is not to replace one form of self-criticism with another. You do not need to tell yourself that you were foolish for chasing. Understands. You were responding to something that mattered deeply to you. You were trying to protect a connection. You were trying to avoid loss. You were trying to make sense of behavior that felt confusing. There was probably a reason you kept trying, but understanding why you chased can help you recognize when the pattern begins again. Understands. The next time someone withdraws, you may notice the urge to immediately prove yourself. You may recognize the impulse to send another message. You may feel the need to explain your intentions one more time. Instead of automatically following that impulse, you can pause and ask a different question. What is their behavior telling me? Understands. That question changes your position. You stop treating distance as a problem you must solve. You start treating it as information. You stop asking how to become the person they finally choose. You start asking whether their way of relating is compatible with the kind of relationship you want. And perhaps that is where the deepest transformation begins. Understands. The goal is no longer to understand the avoidant well enough to make them stay. The goal becomes understanding yourself well enough that you no longer abandon yourself when someone else walks away. Because sometimes the greatest psychological breakthrough is not discovering why they pulled away. Understands. It is discovering why their withdrawal once convinced you that you had to run after them. The moment you get your power back is rarely the moment another person finally understands what they did to you. It is rarely the moment they apologize, return, or admit that they were wrong. Understands. Real power begins much earlier. When you stop trying to control another person's emotions and start taking responsibility for your own participation in the relationship. You cannot control whether someone misses you. You cannot control whether they regret losing you. You cannot control whether they become emotionally available. Stands. You cannot control whether they decide to return. But you can decide whether you will continue participating in a cycle that repeatedly leaves you anxious, exhausted, and questioning your own worth. This is an important distinction because emotional pain can create the desire for control. Stands. When someone pulls away, you naturally want to do something that changes the situation. You want them to understand. You want them to realize what they are losing. You want them to feel the weight of your absence. You want them to finally recognize that your love was genuine. Understands. But when your peace depends on producing a reaction in another person, your power remains outside of you. Their behavior determines your emotional state. Their message creates hope. Their silence creates anxiety. Their return creates relief. Their withdrawal creates pain. Your entire emotional world begins moving according to someone else's choices. Stands. Getting your power back means stepping out of that position. You can love someone without chasing them. That may be one of the hardest lessons to learn because love can create a strong desire to act. When you care about someone, reaching out can feel like proof of your feelings. You may believe that if you truly love them, you should keep trying. Understands. Yet love does not require endless pursuit. You can care about someone's life, understand their struggles, remember the good moments, and still choose to stop running after them. Love can remain present even when pursuit ends. You can miss someone without contacting them. Missing a person is an emotion. It does not have to become an instruction. Understands. You can wake up thinking about them. You can remember their voice. You can miss the conversations you shared. You can feel the empty space their presence left behind. None of those feelings require you to reopen a relationship that was hurting you. Emotions can be experienced without being acted upon immediately. Understands. This is where emotional strength begins to develop. You learn that feeling something deeply does not mean you have to surrender your boundaries. You can care without abandoning yourself. This may be the most important part of the entire transformation. Caring for another person should not require you to become smaller. Understands. You should not have to silence your needs, accept endless uncertainty, or constantly adjust yourself to prevent someone from withdrawing. You can understand that an avoidant person may struggle with closeness while also recognizing that you deserve consistency. Compassion and self-respect can exist together. Understands. You can forgive without reopening the same wound. Forgiveness does not require renewed access. You can release resentment without inviting the same behavior back into your life. You can understand why someone acted the way they did without deciding that you must experience the same pain again. Understands. Forgiveness can simply mean that you refuse to carry the relationship inside your mind forever. You no longer need revenge. You no longer need them to suffer so that your pain feels justified. You allow yourself to move forward. You can also leave without becoming bitter. Understands. Walking away does not have to turn you into someone who hates the person you once loved. You do not have to rewrite every good memory as a lie. You do not have to convince yourself that they were completely terrible so you can justify leaving. Sometimes a person can have good qualities and still be unable to offer the kind of relationship you need. Understands. Sometimes there can be genuine love and genuine incompatibility at the same time. Accepting that reality can be far healthier than turning the entire relationship into a battle between a villain and a victim. This is also where the desire to make the avoidant regret losing you begins to lose its importance. Understands. You may eventually discover that their regret is not the reward you thought it would be. Even if they miss you, your life still has to continue. Even if they return, you still have to decide whether their behavior is healthy for you. Even if they apologize, you still have to decide what boundaries are necessary. Understands. Their realization cannot replace your own. Power is therefore, I want you to feel what I felt. Power says, I no longer need you to feel it for me to heal. Revenge waits for a reaction. Power continues living. Revenge keeps checking whether the other person noticed. Power stops checking. Understands. Revenge remains emotionally connected to the person through anger. Power creates distance without needing hatred. This is why walking away can become an act of self-respect rather than punishment. You are not leaving because you want to destroy the other person's emotional world. Understands. You are leaving because you finally understand that your emotional world deserves protection too. You are allowing them to make their choices without trying to force a different outcome. At the same time, you're allowing yourself to make choices that support your own peace. Understands. And something changes when you stop trying to control their emotions. Their silence becomes theirs. Their confusion becomes theirs. Their regret becomes theirs. Their healing becomes theirs. Their decision to return or remain distant becomes theirs. You no longer have to carry responsibility for every emotional consequence of their behavior. Stands. Your responsibility is different. It is choosing what you participate in. It is choosing what you tolerate. It is choosing what you give your energy to. It is choosing whether a relationship supports the person you are becoming. And once you understand that, you can care deeply without losing yourself inside the relationship. Stands. You can love someone and still walk away. You can remember them and still move forward. You can wish them healing without waiting for them to heal you. You can leave the door closed without standing outside it hoping they will knock. Stands. The power comes from knowing that your life does not have to stop simply because another person's heart has not yet learned how to meet yours. They did not necessarily lose you the moment they pulled away. In the beginning, they may have believed that distance was simply another phase of the relationship. They stepped back and you moved closer. Stands. They became quiet and you tried to understand. They created emotional space and you tried to bridge it. From their perspective, the relationship could continue because your response remained predictable. Even when they created distance, you were still emotionally present. Even when you were hurt, you were still trying. Stands. Even when you felt exhausted, some part of you was still hoping that the next conversation would change everything. But something happened that they may never have expected. You eventually realized that maintaining the connection was costing you too much of yourself. You began to understand that your peace had become the price of staying. Stands. Every time they withdrew, you carried the emotional weight. Every time communication disappeared, you tried to restore it. Every time uncertainty appeared, you tried to create certainty. You were doing more than loving someone. You were constantly managing the relationship around their distance. And eventually, you became tired of doing that. Stands. This is where the real loss begins to take a different shape. It is not necessarily about losing access to your love in one dramatic moment. It is about losing access to the version of you who would endlessly chase, endlessly explain, endlessly wait, and endlessly accept the same cycle. Stands. The person who used to stand at the emotional edge of the relationship waiting for them to turn around is no longer standing there. You stopped. And stopping changed more than your communication. It changed your position inside the relationship. You were no longer reacting to every withdrawal. You were no longer treating every silence as an emergency. Stands. You were no longer believing that it was your responsibility to repair every emotional distance. You were no longer measuring your value by their ability to choose you. Stands. The old pattern depended on your participation. Their withdrawal created a reaction, and your reaction helped keep the pattern moving. Once you stopped responding in the familiar way, the cycle could no longer continue exactly as it had before. The avoidant could still choose distance, but distance no longer automatically produced your pursuit. Stands. That can be a profound change, because the person they thought they could always return to has become someone who understands their own limits. You may still love them. You may still think about them. You may still remember the good moments. You may still wish things had turned out differently. But your feelings no longer require you to run after them. Stands. That is the part they may never have expected. They may have expected you to stop temporarily. They may have assumed you were upset and would eventually calm down. They may have believed that enough time would pass and you would reach out again. They may have thought your love was stronger than your frustration. Stands. Perhaps they were used to seeing your patience as evidence that you would always remain available. Then time passed, and you still did not chase. Your silence became different because it was no longer a temporary reaction. It became evidence of a deeper internal change. You had begun understanding that love cannot be sustained by one person's effort. Stands. You had begun recognizing that compassion does not require self-abandonment. You had begun accepting that someone can have emotional wounds and still be responsible for how their behavior affects a relationship. This is where the entire story comes back to the title. The avoidant thought you would chase them forever, but you stopped. Stands. Not because you suddenly stopped caring. Not because every feeling disappeared. Not because you wanted revenge. Not because you wanted to make them suffer. You stopped because you finally understood that continuing to chase someone who repeatedly walked away meant walking away from yourself. And that is a very different kind of ending. Stands. Perhaps they notice your absence. Perhaps they wonder why you your value later. Perhaps they return. Perhaps they never do. Those possibilities are outside your control. The transformation does not depend on which one happens. The deeper change is that their reaction no longer determines your next move. Stands. You are no longer waiting for their emotional awakening before allowing yourself to live. You are no longer waiting for an apology before giving yourself peace. You are no longer waiting for their return before believing that you were worth choosing. You are choosing yourself now. And choosing yourself does not mean that the love you gave was foolish. Stands. It means that the love you gave taught you something important about the kind of relationship you need. You need connection that does not require constant pursuit. You need communication that does not disappear whenever emotions become difficult. Understands. You need closeness where both people can move toward each other, rather than one person constantly running after the other. So perhaps they did not truly lose you when they pulled away. Perhaps they began losing access to you when you realized you could no longer keep sacrificing your peace to maintain the connection. Understands. And perhaps the greatest thing they never expected was never that you would stop loving them. It was that you would finally love yourself enough to stop running after someone who kept walking away. The avoidant thought you would chase them forever. Understands. They thought there would always be another message, another explanation, another chance, another moment when you would return and try to repair what had been broken. They became comfortable with the idea that no matter how far they pulled away, you would eventually come closer again. But eventually you stopped. Understands, and your stopping was not punishment, it was not a game. It was not an attempt to make them jealous or force them to regret losing you. It was a boundary, it was acceptance, it was self-respect. Understands. You finally understood that loving someone does not mean endlessly pursuing them. Caring about someone does not mean accepting the same pain again and again. Understanding their wounds does not mean abandoning your own needs to protect them from discomfort. Maybe they realize your value. Maybe they reach out. Maybe they miss you. Understands. Maybe they regret the distance. Maybe they never come back. But the most important change has already happened. You stopped measuring your worth by whether someone else was willing to stay. You stopped asking, what can I do to make them choose me? And you started asking, is this relationship allowing me to choose myself? That is the real ending. Understands. Because sometimes the person who finally walks away is not the person who stopped caring. It is the person who finally understood that love should never require them to disappear from themselves. The goal was never to make the avoidant chase you. The goal was to stop chasing someone who kept choosing distance. Understands. And when you understand that distinction, you stop waiting for someone else to give you closure. You stop needing their return to prove that you mattered. You stop needing their regret to validate your pain. You simply move forward. Understands. If this message connected with you, take a moment to like this video. Your support helps this channel continue creating content about attachment, emotional healing, self-awareness, and healthier relationships. And if you want more videos like this, subscribe to our channel and stay with us for the next one. Understands. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is not chasing someone back, it is finally choosing yourself.